And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. Thanks for joining us for our marine section for today. Starting off looking at some recap weather on Sunday to see what's going on out over the water. We do have a low that's going to be moving into the west coast of the state. Behind this low, we're going to see a lot of westerly winds moving in, especially to the southwestern portions of the state, but also throughout much of the southern Bering Sea. So we expect some westerly winds getting a little bit stronger here as we get closer towards the Alaska Peninsula. And similarly, we're going to have some westerly flow pushing all the way across the Gulf of Alaska, bringing in some rain to the Panhandle as well. Then as we move into Monday, we're starting to see a lot of those stronger winds start to diminish here, a weaker flow pattern. But we do have another system headed towards the Aleutian Islands. So we're going to see an uptick in winds ahead of this system, and that's going to bring in a lot of southerly winds towards the eastern Aleutian Islands. Ridging out over the southwest coast will help diminish those winds a little bit as well. So looking now at the forecast, starting off in southeast on Sunday. Inside waters, we're going to see south to southeast winds up to 25 knots with gusts up to 40 knots, especially in the central and northern portions of the inside waters. Out over the Gulf waters, we're going to see 25 knots out of the south, becoming 30 knots out of the east as we get farther to the north. Then on Monday, inside water is going to drop down quite a bit. Southeast flow 10 to 15 knots and southerly winds in the Gulf areas only around 10 knots as well. Moving into south central out over the Gulf waters, southwesterly winds 25 to 30 knots, coming a little bit more southerly as we get in the northern portions closer towards Prince William Sound. In Prince William Sound, though, we're going to see 20 knots out of the south. In Cook Inlet area, we're going to see southwesterly winds at 30 knots. And then on the western side of the Barren Islands, 25 knots is expected. On Monday, going to still see those southwest winds in Cook Inlet, 20 to 25 knots, 20 to 25 knots around the Barren Islands out of a westerly direction, and 10 to 20 knots as we get into the Gulf waters, still primarily out of that westerly direction. In Prince William Sound, going to see a little bit different here, southeast winds 10 knots. For the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island on Sunday, around the island, we're going to see southwesterly winds 25 to 30 knots. Then on the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, 20 knots out of a southwesterly direction, stronger on the Bering side, 30 knots expected there. On Monday for Kodiak, we're going to see westerly flow, 20 to 25 knots. And then from the island down, we're going to start to shift and have a southerly direction to the winds as we get closer towards False Pass. Out of the south, 30 knots expected there. On the Bering side, we're going to see 25 to 30 knots out of a southwesterly direction. For the Aleutians, for the eastern Aleutians as well as the central Aleutian Islands, 25 to 30 knots out of a westerly to southwesterly direction. And then for the western Aleutian Islands, southwest winds, 20 to 25 knots is expected. On Monday, that's going to increase 35 to 40 knots for the western Aleutian Islands, central Aleutian Islands, 35 to 40 knots out of a south-southwest direction. Seas getting up to as high as 14 feet there. And then for the eastern Aleutian Islands, southerly winds 35 to 40 knots. Along the west coast, we'll start up in the Norton Sound area, southeasterly winds 30 knots there. Along the coastline down towards Nunavut Island, southwest winds 30 to 35 knots. That's going to stay true south of Nunavut Island as well, 35 knots there. And then west to southwest winds as we get further out into the Bering Sea, around 30 knots. On Monday, switching flow going to be more northwesterly, 25 knots up north, 25 knots out of a southwesterly direction south of Nunavut Island, and southerly winds by the Pribilof Islands, 30 knots, same for the St. Matthew Island area. Finally, up north along the Arctic coastline, easterly winds 15 knots, picking up to 20 knots as we get closer towards Utqiagvik, and then up to 25 knots out of a northeasterly direction as we drop down the coast towards the Bering Strait. On Monday, we do expect northerly winds around 10 knots, becoming westerly 20 as we get by Kaktovik. And then down the west coast, 15 to 20 knots, increasing to 25 knots out of a northerly direction as we approach the Bering Strait. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer. Thanks for watching.